Well, you know who that is, of course. When I was a child, I actually thought Jesus had sat for that portrait. This was done in 1941, and I think I'm not alone on that. Werner Salman did this, entitled Head of Christ. 500 million reproductions, and probably still counting today. And a lot of us, not only me, just, of course, assume that's the way Jesus looks because we were exposed to it as children in our homes or in Sunday school. And it's familiar in another sense if you think about it. I mean, Jesus with the light brown hair with the blonde highlights and the Northern European features, well, it just kind of feels a little familiar to many of us. And we like his mild, steady gaze, certain calmness about it. In other words, the picture captures the way we think about Jesus. But it is also true, as some have observed, that looking at this picture, it's hard to imagine this Jesus wielding a whip. Of course, I'm referring to our gospel today, when Jesus crashes in, whip in hands, kicks over tables, and drives out the money changers. It's also true that it's hard to imagine how such a respectable, reasonable-looking person pictured there would be such an offense to the authorities that they arrested and tortured him and crucified him. I don't really have an argument with this picture, as a matter of fact. I sort of like it. But I do want to suggest today that there is a temptation that we all have to try to mold Jesus into who we want Jesus to be for us. We have a very different picture of Jesus today, of course, in our gospel. The so-called cleansing of the temple is the only violent act recorded done by Jesus. So why was he so angry? He says, "How dare you turn my Father's house into a market?" And that does seem wrong on the face of it, and occasionally have people around here a little bit nervous with all of the things we sell out there in the narthex. But, not saying, but do bear in mind, when the money changers and the folks selling the sacrificial animals, they were doing this so that worship was possible in the temple in the first place. The people who came to worship had Roman coins traveling there to Jerusalem. They needed to change them to shekels in order to have a perfect sacrifice, a spotless lamb, or a perfect turtle dove to offer, as God's law demanded, I might add, required that somebody be there to provide these animals. What in the world did the disciples make of what happened? I think when Jesus exploded, they must have been cringing in the corner. Not only was he so mad, he was mad in the temple. I told this story recently in the adult class. It's one of those things that happens, you're sort of forever there in your memory. This was a time when we lived in Springfield and our children were small, and I'm driving to church on Sunday morning and I'm late. And the reason I'm late are because of the two young children in the car. And I am furious, and I'm grabbing the steering wheel, and I'm not saying anything. I'm just fuming, and I'm merging from Route 4 onto 70, and then I remember, I'll tell you exactly where it was, and my daughter said ever so slowly and thoughtfully, "You know, Mom, you're a lot nicer at church." I am, and so are you, most of the time. Jesus wasn't nice that day. He wasn't meek and mild. He didn't carry a little lamb over his shoulders. He drove the sheep out with a whip. And he wasn't just mad in the temple. He was mad in the temple at Passover, which was the happiest day on the calendar. It would be like Pastor Craig hurling the Christmas tree out the door on Christmas Eve. Unthinkable. And I only use him as an example because you really couldn't think of me doing that. Seriously, Passover was a great celebration of the liberation of God's people from slavery in Egypt. People had come to the temple to be with God. They were happy to be there. And here we have Jesus, whip in hand, screaming, "Get out!" Matthew, Mark, and Luke all include the same episode, by the way, in their Gospels, but they place it at the end of Jesus' ministry. And there it's a little easier to make allowances for Jesus. In their account, it comes after people have stopped flocking to him. It comes after all those tricky questions the Pharisees kept presenting in order to trap him. It comes after his disciples repeatedly failed to grasp what he was saying, even when he spelled it out in rather exquisite detail. It comes when Jesus enters Jerusalem to face his passion. As all this tension mounts in the other Gospels, Jesus explodes. And we can kind of get that. But notice in our Gospel today from John, he places this at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, when people are admiring of him and impressed with him. At this point in John's Gospel, Jesus has exactly one miracle under his belt, and that is to change water into fine wine. What's to argue with that? Now, maybe there were 2 cleansings of the temple, but I suspect that John was trying to make a point. I think John wanted them and us to understand right from the beginning that in Jesus, God was doing a new and mighty thing. When Jesus came on the scene, assumptions and preconceived ideas about who God is were going out the window. There would be no business as usual, but then when was worship ever meant to be a business? Understand, Jesus wasn't talking about changing policies or procedures, about reforming who gets to sell what in the temple. He was uprooting the whole thing. Jesus was replacing it all with himself. In John's Gospel, Jesus makes a lot of famous I am statements. You know them. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world, and so on. Today, with whip in hand, Jesus says, in effect, to them and us, I am here. When we come to worship, we too are in the presence of the great I am. And maybe, while not an entirely happy thought, we might want to reflect on what things in our own lives, what tables, as it were, should be overturned. What preconceived ideas, what practices, what opinions, what idols should go crashing down. It isn't all that hard for us to confess that there are things that stand between us and God, and if you're sort of casting around for an example, you remember that we heard the 10 Commandments read to us this morning. Always a good place to start and refresh our minds. But I would also have you notice that Jesus doesn't go after the list of thou shalt nots as we commonly think of the 10 Commandments. He doesn't call out the adulterers or the liars or the thieves and throw them out of the temple. No, in our Gospel, Jesus went right for the heart of worship, challenging us, what does it mean to worship God? Challenging our worship, the very place we thought we were at our best and certainly nicest. Is it possible that there is anything about our worship that would bring down Jesus' righteous indignation? Can we imagine Jesus flying into a rage and the pew chairs hurled through the air and the piano on its back and these vestments thrown out on the sidewalk? Not easily. And yet, we know Zeal for his Father's house consumed him that day in the temple. Do we imagine it's less so now? How then are we to worship? From the book of Hebrews we read, "Offer to God an acceptable worship with reverence and awe. For indeed our God is a consuming fire." As one pastor pointed out, these days we often approach God with less reverence and awe and more of a let's make a deal approach. I mean, not in an obvious way, but maybe even not that subtle. The deal is, I'll come to church, I'll throw my offering in the plate, I'll sing the songs, I'll say my prayers, and I get God's stamp of approval. I get a sort of spiritual fill-up, good for another week. And the religious professionals, the religion professionals here, are in this business. We are tasked with trying to make this as brief and pleasant as possible. Or hadn't you noticed how desperate we are to get it out of here in under an hour? You often hear it said, attend church, it's good for you. You make friends. It's good for your health and your family life. Not to mention, it could be very good for business. Great contacts. Now, it's not that these things aren't true, of course, and some of them even good in themselves. But what is the primary reason that we gather? Is it not to worship God? So at very least, I think our gospel invites us to consider when we come to this place, are we truly aware that we are coming into the presence of the living God? Annie Dillard, the wonderful author who wrote something about Christians that I've always found both very, very funny and rather painful. This is what she wrote. On the whole, I do not find Christians outside the catacombs sufficiently sensible of their condition. Does anyone have the foggiest idea what sort of power we so blithely invoke? Or, as I suspect, does no one believe a word of it? The churches are like children playing on the floor with their chemistry sets mixing TNT. We should all be wearing crash helmets. Ushers should issue life preservers and signal flares. They should lash us to our pews, for the sleeping God may wake someday and take offense. Or the waking God may draw us out to where we can never return. I think Jesus took everybody by surprise when he lashed out at the temple that day. I really do wonder what the disciples made of it. When they asked him why he had exploded, he gave a strange reply. He said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." This massive, gorgeous temple in Jerusalem. That seemed as strange a thing to say as Jesus making a whip, driving out the animals, the money changers, and yelling at everyone, throwing those tables. But later, after he was arrested and tortured, after he hung on the cross until he gave up his last breath, later, when he broke through the stone wall of death and passed into victory, the disciples remembered the words, and they believed. And what are we to believe? We come to this place for worship. It's good for us to remember that we come before a demanding, righteous God who will not allow us to worship anything less than God. It is good for us to remember that we come before a great and compassionate God who loved us so much he gave his only Son to die for us and to give us life in him. Someone asked me this week, what does it mean to fear God? I had my ready answer already. But I think now I should have simply asked in return, what does it mean to love God? And if your answer includes both, maybe we're getting somewhere. Thanks be to God. Amen.